everyone. Today we are moving into the respiratory system at long last. This is the last system that we're going to study in grade 11. So again, thinking back, we want to make sure that we're making those connections to our disorders project. With the respiratory system, I'm going to sort of label a bunch of these things for us. We're not going to necessarily talk about all of them in the lesson notes. We're really going to talk about the ones that relate directly to the main purpose of the respiratory system, which was bulk gas exchange. So coming into the respiratory system, we have nasal passage and the mouth. The job of both of these passages is not just to let the air in, it also has a really important feature of purifying the air. So basically, through our nasal passages, the reason we have hair there is to actually block things that might be in the air from coming all the way into the lungs. As well, in the mouth and also the pharynx, which is essentially just the throat, shared by both digestive and respiratory, we start to actually warm the air, and we also have mucus there, which is basically trapping any particles that are undesirable to end up down in the lungs themselves. Down here we have the larynx, and the larynx is another word for the voice box. So if you're talking and you put your fingers here, you should be able to feel a vibration happening. And the reason why it's included as part of the respiratory system is that we are actually utilizing our breath to essentially make different sounds using our vocal cords. So we are modifying our breathing in doing that, in just speaking. We don't necessarily think about it that often because we're used to speaking quite a lot, but the larynx is considered part of the respiratory for that reason. Then we have the trachea. So the trachea is a tube, but it's made of flexible bone called cartilage, and also sometimes called the windpipe, which is fine. The reason why it's made of a flexible bone called cartilage is that it essentially has some flexibility to it. So when we lie down, for example, we don't end up squishing it. Okay, it flexes, so it doesn't break as a normal bone would. That's quite brittle. It has the ability to fold inwards, but then fold back outwards. Really, the purpose of that flexibility, like I said, was that you should be able to always breathe. Okay, so evolutionarily, there shouldn't be a time where you're completely collapsed there because you've got that flexibility. You're going to see also there's sort of like these round ridges. Okay, those are also a bit of a harder bone. Again, trying to maintain that cannot be crushed. And it should not be able to break as well. Now, there are exceptions to that, of course, and some of you may be looking at that for your disorders project, so you can look into what that all looks like as well. Surrounding the lungs here, we have what's called the pleural membranes. And I had mentioned previously about the heart. Oftentimes our organs have a membrane around them, which helps reduce friction. So the heart would be like right under here. So we really want to make sure there's no friction there. Also right above this is our rib cage. So our rib cage also has a membrane on it, so to prevent friction, because if these are rubbing against bone, for example, they're going to become damaged pretty quickly. Then we have also the right bronchus and the left bronchus. So those are the tubes that are going into respectively the right and left lungs. The plural is called the bronchi. So you might have heard it described as that. The bronchi on each side are going to then branch off into smaller bronchioles. Okay. And eventually, at the end of the bronchioles, we find these little air sacs, which are called alveoli. And our lungs have millions of these alveoli. They are the location of gas exchange within our lungs. So we will take a really close look at them after. They have extremely, extremely thin membranes, and they are very, very small. So we'll talk more about their structure soon. And then below all of this is the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is an elastic muscle that essentially separates our chest cavity from our thoracic cavity. And that separation is actually extremely important because, as we'll talk about, the diaphragm is responsible for helping us breathe. Okay. Not shown in this diagram, but I show it on the diagram on page 2, is the rib cage. The rib cage actually does a lot more than just protecting our organs underneath it. It actually is aiding us in our respiration, in our actual breathing. So more about that on the other page. Again, the purpose of the respiratory system is bulk gas exchange for cellular respiration. And the reason I say bulk gas exchange is that I need lots of O2 molecules to come in, and I'm also going to need lots of CO2 waste to go out. So this is why the term for bulk that I'm talking about. Oxygen is needed for energy production for cellular respiration. Again, we always come back to this equation, which I've shown you many times in this course. Oxygen, which is breathed in through the respiratory system, plus glucose, which we access from the digestive system. These are moved around by the circulatory system that we talked about before. And ultimately, we end up with carbon dioxide, water, and energy. Now, I will tell you a bit more about carbon dioxide in lesson 9 as well, but the carbon dioxide needs to be exhaled by the respiratory system. It can be quite dangerous if we retain too much CO2. So I will tell you a little bit more about that later on as well. So again, I wanted to give a couple of different viewpoints. So I had shown before is sort of like the overall simplified diagram. This diagram that I've added is showing the chest cavity specifically. And the chest cavity or the thoracic cavity is basically a sealed container, except for one spot, which is the trachea. So if you imagine the rib cage, it's all around these lungs. It's completely covering it from all sides, and right beneath it is going to be the diaphragm. So as I mentioned, the diaphragm is really sealing off that thoracic cavity. So the reason I'm calling this a cavity is it has a very specific volume. And if you've taken grade 11 chemistry yet, you know that every container with a volume also has a pressure. And pressure and volume are extremely, extremely important when we come to respirating, when we come to actually breathing, which I will discuss more in lesson 9. So this whole container is actually sealed by the rib cage. It's showing the ribs kind of cut off. The reason is that if we covered it, we wouldn't see the lungs inside. But it would be an enclosed container. So again, the trachea here is made mostly of cartilage. It is flexible to ensure the airway remains open and that we're able to actually get the oxygen in and the CO2 out. Now, in between each of these ribs, so I'm showing the bones here, rib bones. Those are maintaining the overall shape of the chest cavity. They also have a protective aspect to them as well. So as I was saying before, if I was to just lie down, I'm not going to have crushing of my lungs when that happens. The rib cage is maintaining that capacity, maintaining that cavity rather. In between each of these bones rather, which is not shown because it would be really complicated on a diagram, there would be muscles in between each of these. And these muscles are called the intercostal muscles. So if you've ever seen a rack of ribs at the store or you've ever eaten one, you know that there are bones in the middle and the meat part that people eat, that's actually the muscles. Okay, those are the intercostal muscles of that particular animal that you've got the ribs from. Again, we have down here is the diaphragm, and that's separating the chest cavity from the rest of the stuff. So it's making a very sealed container. Very specific volume, very specific pressure. And in lesson 9, we're going to discuss why that pressure and volume are so, so important. The purpose of this being here is just to show you the structures involved with the respiratory system. We will talk more about the importance here in the next lesson. So I want to zoom in on the alveoli. So I mentioned that the alveoli are at the end, essentially, of all of those bronchioles that we saw there. So in this picture, I'm showing that the alveoli are very, very thin. They're made of epithelial, which is just skin tissue, and that thinness that we were talking about with capillaries as well, it's for increased diffusion. So if these alveoli had really, really thick walls, it's going to be really hard for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse through that. But if they're very thin, which they are, just as the capillaries are, you're going to be really easy to transfer things in and out. So again, we come back to this idea of surface area. These alveoli are extremely, extremely small, which just like our cells or just like our capillaries, etc., means that they have a high surface area to volume ratio. And so what that means is high surface area is better for diffusion of gases. So in terms of evolution, which we've spoken about before, there's always a reason as to why something is the way it is. It's not random. Okay, so here the reason is that these being extremely tiny is because they increase surface area. They make it more efficient. So just a little bit of more stuff about this diagram. These blue vessels are showing the pulmonary artery. So I said this is incoming from the heart. Here we have the capillary network, which we talked about in lesson 5, I believe, a really narrow sort of network, high pressure for the blood, where things are easily able to come in and out of the blood. Then we have over here the red section. The red section is the pulmonary veins. They are going back towards the heart, which ultimately, like we've talked about in lesson 7, is going to be pumped then around to the body, around to all the other tissues. So at this point, we're going to zoom even further into this single alveolus, which is one alveoli, and the capillary networks that are around it. So I want to just mention, again, we're talking about gas exchange here. Here I've drawn a zoomed in picture of what we would see in that capillary network as well as alveolus structure. I wanted to mention again, there are millions of alveoli in the lungs. Here we're just looking at a single alveolus. So a couple of things I want to reinforce. The actual alveoli is an air sac, and this sac has a very thin wall, which is just one cell in thickness. So imagine a very thin skin. That is essentially what's making this up. The same thing with this network. So you'll see here that I wrote pulmonary artery. That means that it's feeding into this capillary. And here it eventually will go back to the pulmonary vein. Again, capillaries very thin. So they're not a thick layer full of smooth muscle like an artery would be. It's made of just one single cell thickness. So really thin membranes. Think of a really thin skin. What I'm showing in this diagram is a couple things. So from the pulmonary artery comes deoxygenated blood, which has lots of CO2 in it. Here, diffusion is going to happen. This means that the CO2, which is in high concentration in the blood over here, is going to be pushed into, over here, CO2 into the alveolus. The CO2 is moving from high to low concentration. After this happens, you're going to have exhalation, okay? And I'm going to describe that further in lesson number 9. On the oxygen side of it is that now oxygen is very low concentration in the blood cell. So you're going to see oxygen moving from the alveolus after an inhalation into the red blood cell. And then this red blood cell is going to continue on its way to the pulmonary vein and then ultimately back to the heart. Now, a couple of things I want to mention here. I said it in green writing here. It requires moisture for diffusion. So I had mentioned before, everything has to be bathed in water, and that is definitely the case in here. Within the blood, we know the plasma is mostly made of water anyway, so that's fine. But our lungs actually need to be bathed in water as well. And I don't mean that I want you to breathe water in, but these alveoli on the surface of them, it has to be essentially bathed in moisture, bathed in water. That water is going to allow movement of CO2 and oxygen in and out to happen. Okay, without that, we can't have any diffusion happening. So more about this inhalation, exhalation a little bit later. I just want to mention here, the red blood cells are moving through in single file. And I had mentioned in our blood vessels lesson 6, I believe, is that we want to really slow the blood down, okay? So part of why we have it just going one at a time, single file, is that we really don't want them to rush through and then they don't actually exchange their CO2 for oxygen. That would be an extremely inefficient system. Okay, they'd be missing their opportunity and they wouldn't have another opportunity until they went all the way back around the whole body and then got back here. So really important that these are very small and have a very high surface area to volume ratio. That is what lets diffusion happen. So a bit more information about that. In the alveolus, the concentration of oxygen is high, while in the blood it's low, again, due to inhalation. This causes movement of oxygen from the alveolus into the blood, and the opposite is also true. In the blood, the concentration of carbon dioxide is high because it's just traveled around the body, and in the alveolus, it's low. So this will cause movement of carbon dioxide from blood to alveolus. And then, of course, once that's exhaled, the concentration of CO2 there will be low again. So again, just to remind you from our digestive unit, diffusion works by moving particles from a high concentration to a low concentration. And this does not require any energy. It is just simply based on moving from high to low, okay? Diffusion specifically, we don't require any of those membrane proteins, those channels, those tunnels, any of that stuff. CO2 and oxygen are small enough, they can diffuse directly through. So that also helps a lot with the efficiency. The surface area of the alveolus and the capillary are both very, very high. And so together, that also increases efficiency of diffusion. The last thing I'll just mention here is I was just talking about how thin and delicate these membranes are. So one of the things that I've put as an activity for you guys to do, it's sort of optional, is to think about smoking. And smoking, we are intentionally bringing into the lungs a lot of pretty harsh chemicals. And so what happens when people smoke repeatedly or over like many, many years even, or whatever the case might be? Those chemicals start to actually damage these really thin membranes of the alveoli. And ultimately, what can happen, unfortunately, is that you could create actually holes in these alveoli. And if that's to happen, then that air sac is basically useless. So those air sacs, once they're damaged, we don't see them repair because they're so delicate. So even though we have millions of them in our lungs, as we start to actually destroy different alveoli in there, basically that whole section where those are destroyed, that's not going to be able to take in air anymore. And so the lung capacity of that person ends up declining greatly. Okay, it becomes very difficult. So they will have pockets of their lungs where there's no air actually going in. This can lead to problems like emphysema and so forth, which again, some of you might be researching for your disorders project. But something to think about is that if we are intentionally bringing chemicals into these areas, we may actually cause irreparable damage, which ultimately is going to be a lower, essentially lower amount of air that we're able to actually take in. So just something to consider as you're working through, especially for your disorders project also.